or even be able to reply to all of your emails, but we will aim to air some of your suggestions later this year. Once again, the email address is radio4extra@bbc.co.uk, so please get in contact and we look forward to hearing from you soon.
This
is BBC Radio 4 Extra.
Now, celebrating its 70th anniversary this month, we've the second and concluding omnibus of Ian Fleming's first James Bond novel, Casino Royale, read by Alex Jennings. Today, the British Secret Service agent James Bond, aka 007, continues to pursue the fraudster Le Chiffre, who has absconded with 25 million francs of Soviet money and is being hunted by the sinister Smersh. Bond's life is in danger, and something is troubling his girlfriend, Vesper.
At the hotel, Leiter insisted on accompanying Bond to his room. Both men had their hands on their guns. It was as Bond had left it 6 hours before. "No reception committee," observed Leiter, "but I wouldn't put it past them to try a last throw. Do you think I ought to stay up and keep you company?" "No, you get your sleep," said Bond. "They won't be interested in me without the money, and I've got an idea for looking after that. Thanks for all you've done. I hope we get on a job again one day." "Suits me," said Leiter, "so long as you can draw a 9 when it's needed. And bring Vesper along with you," he added dryly. He went out and closed the door. Bond turned away and took out of his pocket the cheque for 40 million francs. He folded this very small. Then he opened the door and looked up and down the corridor. He left the door wide open, and with his ears cocked for footsteps or the sound of the lift, he set to work with a small screwdriver. 5 minutes later, he gave a last-minute survey to his handiwork, put some fresh cigarettes in his case, closed and locked the door, and went off down the corridor and across the hall and out into the moonlight. Bond took Vesper's arm and led her over the gilded step of the Roi Gallant. The nightclub was small and dark, lit only by candles in gilded candelabra. In the far corner, a trio consisting of a piano, an electric guitar and drums was playing La Vie en Rose with muted sweetness. Seduction dripped on the quietly throbbing air. They were given a corner table near the door. Bond ordered a bottle of Veuve Clicquot and scrambled eggs and bacon. They sat for a time listening to the music, and then Bond turned to Vesper. "It's wonderful sitting here with you and knowing the job's finished. It's a lovely end to the day. The prize-giving." He expected her to smile. She said, "Yes, isn't it?" in a rather brittle voice. Between the thumb and first 2 fingers of her right hand, she held one of Bond's cigarettes, as an artist holds a crayon, and though she smoked with composure, she tapped the cigarette occasionally into an ashtray, when the cigarette had no ash. Bond noticed these small things because he felt intensely aware of her and wanted to draw her into his own feeling of relaxed sensuality. But he accepted her reserve. He thought it came from a desire to protect herself from him, or else was a reaction to his coolness earlier. He was patient. He drank champagne and talked a little about the happenings of the day. She answered perfunctorily. She sipped at her champagne and rarely glanced at Bond. He felt frustrated. The scrambled eggs came, and they ate in silence. At 4 o'clock, Bond was about to call for the bill when the maître d'hôtel appeared at their table and inquired for Miss Lind. He handed her a note, which she took and read hastily. "Oh, it's only Matisse," she said. "He says when I come to the entrance hall, he's got a message for you. Perhaps he's not in evening clothes or something. I won't be a minute. Then perhaps we could go home." She gave him a strained smile. "I'm afraid I don't feel very good company this evening. It's been a rather nerve-wracking day. I'm so sorry." Bond watched her take the few steps to the entrance. He lit a cigarette. He felt flat. He took a last mouthful of champagne. It tasted bitter, as the first glass too many always does. He would have liked to have seen Matisse's cheerful face and heard his news, perhaps even a word of congratulation. Suddenly the note to Vesper seemed odd to him. It was not the way Matisse would do things. He would have joined them in the nightclub, whatever his clothes. Bond hastily paid the bill, not waiting for the change. He hurried through the gaming room and looked carefully up and down the long entrance hall. He cursed and quickened his step. No Vesper, no Matisse. He was almost running. He got to the entrance and was halfway down the steps when he heard a faint cry, then the slam of a door way to the right. With a harsh growl and stutter from the exhaust, a beetle-browed citron shot out of the shadows into the light of the moon. Its tail rocked on its soft springs as if a violent struggle was taking place on the back seat. With a snarl it raced out to the wide entrance gate in a spray of gravel. A small black object shot out of an open rear window and thudded into a flower bed. The car headed off between the shops on the main street towards the coast road. Bond knew he would find Vesper's evening bag among the flowers. He ran back with it across the gravel to the brightly lit steps and scrabbled through its contents. The crumpled note was there amongst the usual feminine baggage. "Can you come to the entrance hall for a moment? I have news for your companion, René Matisse." It was the crudest possible forgery. Bond leapt for the Bentley, blessing the impulse which had made him drive it over after dinner. As the car rocked to the left outside the gate, Bond settled himself for the pursuit, briefly savouring the echo of the huge exhaust. Soon he was out on the coast road, a broad highway through the sand dunes, which he knew from his morning's drive. He knew the Citroën must have come this way. He hoped soon to see the distant shaft of its headlights. The night was still and clear. As he drove, whipping the car faster and faster through the night, with the other half of his mind he cursed Vesper and M for having sent her on the job. This was just what he had been afraid of. These blithering women who thought they could do a man's work. Why the hell couldn't they stay at home and mind their pots and pans and stick to their frocks and gossip? For Vesper to fall for an old trick like that and get herself snatched and probably held to ransom like some bloody heroine in a strip cartoon. Bond boiled at the thought of the fix he was in. Of course, the idea was a straight swap. The girl against his cheque for 40 million. Well, he wouldn't play. Wouldn't think of playing. She was in the service and knew what she was up against. He wouldn't even ask M. The job was more important than her. Bond's mind raged furiously on with the problem as he flung the great car down the coast road, automatically taking the curves. He knew he must be gaining fast. On an impulse, he slowed down to 70 and turned on his fog lights. Sure enough, without the blinding curtain of his own headlights, he could see the glow of another car a mile or two down the coast. Ahead, in the Citroën, there were 3 men and the girl. Le Chiffre was driving, his big fluid body hunched forward, his hands light and delicate on the wheel. Beside sat the squat man who had carried the stick in the casino. In his left hand he grasped a thick lever. In the back seat was the tall, thin gunman. His right hand lay caressingly on Vesper's left thigh, which stretched out naked beside him. Apart from her legs, which were naked to the hips, Vesper was only a parcel. Her long black velvet skirt had been lifted over her arms and head and tied above her head with a piece of rope. Where her face was, a small gap had been torn in the velvet so that she could breathe. She was not bound in any other way, and she lay quiet, her body moving sluggishly with the swaying of the car. Le Chiffre was concentrating half on the road ahead and half on the onrushing glare of Bond's headlights in the driving mirror. He seemed undisturbed when not more than a mile separated the hare from the hounds, and he even brought the car down from 80 to 60 miles an hour. Now, as he swept round a bend, he slowed down still further. In the mirror, Bond's great headlights were lighting up the bend. Le Chiffre seemed to make up his mind. Allez. The man beside him pulled the lever sharply upwards. The boot at the back of the car yawned open like a whale's mouth. There was a tinkling clatter on the road. Le Chiffre threw the citron left-handed down a narrow side road. He stopped the car with a jerk, and all three men got swiftly out and doubled back under cover of a low hedge to the crossroads, now fiercely illuminated by the lights of the Bentley. Each of them carried a revolver. The Bentley screamed down towards them like an express train. As Bond hurtled round the bend, he was working out his plan of action. He imagined that the enemy driver would try to dodge off into a side road if he got the chance, so when he saw no lights ahead, it was a normal reflex to prepare to brake. He was only doing about 60 as he approached the black patch across the right-hand crown of the road, which he assumed to be the shadow cast by a wayside tree. Even so, there was no time to save himself. There was suddenly a small carpet of glinting steel spikes right under his offside wing. Then he was on top of it. The heavy car whirled across the road in a tearing dry skid, slammed the left bank with a crash that knocked Bond out of the driving seat onto the floor, and then, facing back up the road, it reared slowly up, its front wheels spinning, and its great headlights searching the sky. For a split second, resting on the petrol tank, it seemed to paw at the heavens like a giant praying mantis. Then slowly it toppled over backwards and fell with a splintering crash of coachwork. Le Chiffre and his two men only had to walk a few yards from their ambush. "Put your guns away and get him out," he ordered brusquely. "Be careful of him. I don't want a corpse." The two men got down on their knees. One of them took out a long knife and cut some of the fabric away from the side of the convertible hood and took hold of Bond's shoulders. He was unconscious and immovable. The thin man felt his heart and then slapped his face hard on either side. Bond grunted and moved a hand. The thin man slapped him again. "That's enough," said Le Chiffre. "Tie his arms and put him in the car. Here." He threw a roll of flex to the man. He walked back to the car. His face showed neither pleasure nor excitement. It was the sharp bite of the wire flex into his wrists that brought Bond to himself. When he was yanked to his feet and pushed towards the narrow side road where the engine of the citron was already running softly, he found that no bones were broken. But he felt in no mood for desperate attempts to escape, and allowed himself to be dragged into the back seat of the car without resisting. He looked to the right, past the thin man who was lying back with his eyes closed. His first reaction was one of scorn. Damn fool girl getting herself trussed up like a chicken. But then he felt sorry for her. Her naked legs looked so childlike and defenceless. "Vesper," he said softly. There was no answer from the bundle in the corner, and Bond suddenly had a chill feeling. But then she stirred slightly. At the same time, the thin man caught him a hard, backhanded blow over the heart. "Silence." Bond doubled over with the pain. The thin man had hit him a hard, professional-cutting blow with the edge of the hand. There was something rather deadly about his accuracy and lack of effort. Le Chiffre reversed furiously back onto the main road. By now it was dawn, about 5 o'clock, Bond guessed, and he reflected that a mile or two on was the turning to Le Chiffre's villa. Now that he realized that Vesper had only been a sprat to catch a mackerel, the whole picture became clear. It was an extremely unpleasant picture. For the first time since his capture, fear came to Bond and crawled up his spine. He knew that he was utterly and absolutely in their power. Le Chiffre was standing in the doorway of a room. He crooked a finger at Bond in a silent, spidery summons. It was a large bare room, sparsely furnished in cheap French Art Nouveau style. Over by the window was an incongruous-looking throne-like chair in carved oak with a red velvet seat, a low table on which stood an empty water carafe and 2 glasses, and a light armchair with a round cane seat and no cushion. Le Chiffre pointed at the cane chair. "That will do excellently," he said to the thin man who had followed Bond into the room. "Prepare him quickly. If he resists, Damage him only a little." He turned to Bond. "Take off your clothes. For every effort to resist, Basil will break one of your fingers. We are serious people, and your good health is of no interest to us. Whether you live or die depends on the outcome of the talk we are about to have." He made a gesture towards the thin man and left the room. The thin man's first action was a curious one. He opened the clasp knife he had used on the hood of Bond's car, took the small armchair, and with a swift motion, he cut out its cane seat. Then he turned Bond round to the light and unwound the flex from his wrists. "Vite." Bond looked him in the eye, and then slowly started to take off his shirt. Le Chiffre came quietly back into the room. He carried a pot of what smelt like coffee. He put it on the small table near the window. He also placed beside it on the table 2 other homely objects, a 3-foot-long carpet beater in twisted cane, and a carving knife. He settled himself comfortably on the throne-like chair and poured some of the coffee into one of the glasses. With one foot, he hooked forward the small armchair, whose seat was now an empty circular frame of wood, until it was directly opposite him. Bond stood stark naked in the middle of the room, bruises showing livid on his white body, his face a grey mask of exhaustion and knowledge of what was to come. "Sit down there." Le Chiffre nodded at the chair in front of him. Bond walked over and sat down. The thin man produced some flex. With this he bound Bond's wrists to the arms of the chair and his ankles to the front legs. He passed a double strand across his chest and threw the chair back. He made no mistakes with the knots and left no play in any of the bindings. All of them bit sharply into Bond's flesh. The legs of the chair were broadly spaced, and Bond could not even rock it. He was utterly a prisoner, naked and defenceless. His buttocks and the under part of his body protruded through the seat of the chair towards the floor. Le Chiffre nodded to the thin man, who quietly left the room and closed the door. Then he picked up the cane carpet beater, and resting the handle comfortably on his knee, allowed the flat trefoil base to lie on the floor directly under Bond's chair. He looked Bond carefully, almost caressingly, in the eyes. Then his wrist sprang suddenly upwards on his knee. The result was startling. Bond's whole body arched in an involuntary spasm, his face contracted in a soundless scream, and his lips drew right away from his teeth. For an instant, muscles stood out in knots all over his body, and his toes and fingers clenched until they were quite white. Then his body sagged, and perspiration started to bead all over his body. He uttered a deep groan. Le Chiffre waited for his eyes to open. "You see, dear boy." He smiled a soft, fat smile. "Is the position quite clear now?" A drop of sweat fell off Bond's chin onto his naked chest. "Now, let us get down to business and see how soon we can be finished with this unfortunate mess you have got yourself into." He puffed cheerfully at his cigarette. "My dear boy," Le Chiffre spoke like a father, "the game of Red Indians is over, quite over. You have stumbled by mischance into a game for grown-ups, and you have already found it a painful experience." He suddenly dropped his bantering tone and looked at Bond sharply and venomously. "Where is the money?" Bond's bloodshot eyes looked emptily back at him. Again the upward jerk of the wrist, and again Bond's whole body writhed and contorted. Le Chiffre waited until Bond's eyes dully opened again. "Perhaps I should explain," said Le Chiffre. "I intend to continue attacking the sensitive parts of your body until you answer my question. If you continue to be obstinate, you will be tortured to the edge of madness, and then the girl will be brought in, and we will set about her in front of you. If that is still not enough, you will both be painfully killed, and I shall reluctantly leave your bodies and make my way abroad to a comfortable house which is waiting for me. If you hand the money over, so much the better. If not, I shall shrug my shoulders and be on my way." He paused, and his wrist lifted slightly on his knee. Bond's flesh cringed as the cane's surface just touched him. "Well?" Bond closed his eyes and waited for the pain. Like a rattlesnake, the cane instrument leapt from the floor. It struck again and again, so that Bond screamed and his body jangled in the chair like a marionette. Through the red mist of pain, Bond thought of Vesper. He could imagine how she was being used by the two gunmen. Poor wretch to have been dragged into this. Le Chiffre was talking again. "Torture is a terrible thing," he was saying as he puffed at a fresh cigarette, "but it is a simple matter for the torturer, particularly when the patient," he smiled at the word, "is a man. With this simple instrument one can cause a man as much pain as is possible. It is not only the immediate agony, but also the thought that your manhood is being gradually destroyed, and that at the end, if you will not yield, you will no longer be a man. That, my dear Bond, is inevitable, unless you tell me where you hid the money." He poured some more coffee into the glass. Bond raised his head and spoke thickly. "Money no good to you." His voice was a laborious croak. "Police trace it to you." Exhausted by the effort, his head sank forward again. "Ah, my dear fellow, I had forgotten to tell you." Le Chiffre smiled wolfishly. "We met after our little game at the casino, and you are such a sportsman that you agreed we would have one more run through the pack between the two of us. It was a gallant gesture, typical of an English gentleman. Unfortunately, you lost, and this upset you so much that you decided to leave Royale immediately for an unknown destination. Like the gentleman you are, you very kindly gave me a note explaining the circumstances so that I would have no difficulty in cashing your check. You see, dear boy, everything has been thought of, and you need have no fears on my account." He chuckled fatly. So that was the score, thought Bond, with a final sinking of the heart. The unknown destination would be under the ground, or under the sea, or perhaps more simply under the crashed Bentley. Well, if he had to die anyway, he might as well try it the hard way. He had no hope that Mattis or Leiter would get to him in time, but at least there was a chance that they would catch up with Le Chiffre before he could get away. It was a choice of evils, but the longer Le Chiffre continued the torture, the more likely he would be revenged. Bond lifted his head and looked Le Chiffre in the eyes. The china of the whites was now veined with red. The upward edges of black coffee at the corners of the mouth gave a false smile. "No," he said flatly. Le Chiffre grunted and set to work again with savage fury. Occasionally he snarled like a wild beast. After 10 minutes, Bond had fainted, blessedly. It was extraordinary to hear the third voice. Bond's dimmed senses hardly took it in. Then suddenly he was halfway back to consciousness. He found he could see and hear again. He could hear the dead silence after the one quiet word from the doorway. He could see Le Chiffre's head slowly come up, and the expression of blank astonishment, of innocent amazement, slowly give way to fear. "Stop," had said the voice, quietly. Bond heard slow steps approaching behind his chair. He tried desperately to read into Le Chiffre's face what was happening behind him, but all he saw was blinding comprehension and terror. His hands fluttered vaguely in his lap. His round, staring eyes had lowered for a split second, and Bond guessed there was a gun trained on him. There was a moment's silence. "Smersh." The word came almost with a sigh. It came with a downward cadence, as if nothing else had to be said. It was the final explanation, the last word of all. "No," said Le Chiffre. "No, I—" His voice tailed off. Perhaps he was going to explain, to apologize, but what he must have seen in the other's face made it all useless. "Your 2 men, both dead. You are a fool and a thief and a traitor. I have been sent from the Soviet Union to eliminate you. We cannot see the end of the trouble you have caused. Do you plead guilty?" Bond wrestled with his consciousness. He screwed up his eyes and tried to shake his head to clear it, but his whole nervous system was numbed and no message was transmitted to his muscles. He could just keep his focus on the great pale face in front of him and on its bulging eyes. A thin string of saliva crept from the open mouth and hung down from the chin. "Yes," said the mouth. There was a sharp phut, no louder than a bubble of air escaping from a tube of toothpaste. No other noise at all, and suddenly Le Chiffre had grown another eye, right where the thick nose started to jut out below the forehead. It was a small black eye, without eyelashes or eyebrows. For a second the three eyes looked out across the room. Then the heavy head fell sideways, and finally the whole upper part of the body lurched over the arm of the chair. There was a short rattle of heels on the ground, and then no other movement. A hand came from behind Bond and grasped his chin and pulled it back. For a moment Bond looked up into two glittering eyes behind a narrow black mask. There was the impression of a crag-like face under a hat brim. He could take in nothing more before his head was pushed down again. "You're fortunate," said the voice. "I have no orders to kill you. Your life has been saved twice in one day. But you can tell your organization that Smersh is only merciful by chance or by mistake. I shall leave you my visiting card. You are a gambler. One day perhaps you will play against one of us. It would be well that you should be known as a spy." There was the click of a knife opening. An arm in some grey material came into Bond's line of vision. A broad, hairy hand emerging from a dirty white shirt cuff was holding a thin stiletto like a fountain pen. It poised for a moment above the back of Bond's right hand. Then the point of the stiletto executed 3 quick, straight slashes. A 4th slash crossed them where they ended, just short of the knuckles. Blood in the shape of an inverted M welled out and slowly started to drip onto the floor. The pain was nothing to what Bond was already suffering, but it was enough to plunge him again into unconsciousness. The steps moved quietly away across the room. The door was softly closed. You are about to awake when you dream that you are dreaming. During the next 2 days, James Bond was permanently in this state, without regaining consciousness. He watched the procession of his dreams go by. He felt safer in the darkness, and he hugged it to him. On the morning of the 3rd day, a bloody nightmare shook him awake, trembling and sweating. His whole body was strapped down, and something like a large white coffin covered him from chest to feet and obscured his view of the end of the bed. He shouted a string of obscenities, but the effort took all his strength, and the words tailed off into a sob. Tears of forlornness and self-pity welled out of his eyes. A woman's voice was speaking, and the words gradually penetrated to him. It slowly came to him that he was being comforted, and that this was a friend and not an enemy. He could hardly believe it. He had been so certain that he was still a captive, and that the torture was about to begin again. He felt his face being softly wiped with a cool cloth which smelt of lavender, and then he sank back into his dreams. When he awoke again, some hours later, all his terrors had gone, and he felt warm and languorous. Sun was streaming into the bright room, and in the background there was the noise of small waves on a beach. As he moved his head, he heard a rustle, and a nurse who had been sitting beside his pillow rose and came into his line of vision. "Well, I'm certainly glad you've woken up at last. Never heard such dreadful language in my life." Bond smiled back at her. "Where am I?" he asked, and was surprised that his voice sounded firm and clear. "You're in a nursing home at Royale, and I've been sent over from England to look after you. I'm Nurse Gibson. Now, just lie quiet, and I'll go and tell the doctor you're awake." Bond closed his eyes and mentally explored his body. The worst pain was in his wrists and ankles, and in his right hand where the Russian had cut him. In the centre of the body there was no feeling. He assumed that he had been given a local anaesthetic. The rest of his body ached dully, as if he had been beaten all over. He was preparing a short list of questions in his mind when the door opened, and the doctor came in, followed by the nurse, and in the background the dear figure of Mattis, Mattis looking anxious behind his broad smile. When the doctor spoke, he was forthright. "You have a lot of questions to ask, my dear Mr. Bond," he said in excellent English, "and I can tell you most of the answers. I do not want you to waste your strength, so I will give you the salient facts, and then you may have a few minutes with Monsieur Mattis, who wishes to obtain one or two details from you. It is really too early for this talk, but I wish to set your mind at rest so that we can proceed with the task of repairing your body without bothering too much about your mind." Nurse Gibson pulled up a chair for the doctor and left the room. "You have been here about 2 days," continued the doctor. "Your car was found by a farmer on the way to market in Royale, and he informed the police. After some delay, Monsieur Mattis heard that it was your car, and he immediately went to Le Chiffre's villa with his men. You and Le Chiffre were found, and also your friend Miss Lind, who was unharmed and, according to her account, suffered no molestation. She was prostrated with shock, but is now fully recovered and is at her hotel." The doctor paused. "Your own injuries are serious, but your life is not in danger, though you have lost a lot of blood. If all goes well, you will recover completely, and none of the functions of your body will be impaired." "For how long were you maltreated?" "About an hour," said Bond. "Then it is remarkable that you are alive, and I congratulate you. Few men could have supported what you have been through." The doctor looked at Bond for a moment, and then turned brusquely to Mattis. "You may have 10 minutes, and then you will be forcibly ejected. If you put the patient's temperature up, you will answer for it." He gave them both a broad smile and left the room. Mattis came over and took the doctor's chair. "I have a personal message from M," he said. "He spoke to me himself on the telephone. He simply said to tell you that he is much impressed." I asked if that was all, and he said, "Well, tell him that the Treasury is greatly relieved." Then he rang off. Bond grinned with pleasure. This was quite unheard of. The very existence of M, let alone his identity, was never admitted. He could imagine the flutter this must have caused in the ultra-security-minded organization in London. "A tall, thin man with one arm came over from London the same day we found you," continued Mattis. "He seemed to be Vesper's boss. He spent a lot of time with her and gave her strict instructions to look after you." "Head of S," thought Bond. "They're certainly giving me the red carpet treatment." "Now," said Mattis, "to business. Who killed Le Chiffre?" "Smash," said Bond. Mattis gave a low whistle. "My God," he said respectfully. "So they were onto him. What did he look like?" Bond explained briefly what had happened up to the moment of Le Chiffre's death, omitting all but the most essential details. It cost him an effort. Casting his mind back to the scene awoke the whole nightmare, and as the sweat began to pour off his forehead, Mattis realized that he was going too far. He laid a hand on Bond's shoulder. "Forgive me, my friend," he said. "It is all over now, and you are in safe hands. One last mystery, and then I promise I will go. What about the money? Where is it? Where did you hide it? We have been over your room with a tooth comb. It isn't there." Bond grinned. "It is," he said, "more or less. On the door of each room there is a small square of black plastic with the number of the room on it. On the corridor side, of course. When Leiter left me that night, I simply opened the door and unscrewed my number plate and put the folded check underneath it. It'll still be there." Mattis laughed delightedly. "I suppose you think that's paid me back for knowing what the Muncies were up to. Well, I'll call it quits." He rose hastily as the doctor stormed into the room and took one look at Bond. "Out," he said to Mattis. "Out and don't come back." Mattis just had time to wave cheerfully to Bond and call some hasty words of farewell before he was hustled through the door. Bond lay back, exhausted, but heartened by all he had heard. He found himself thinking of Vesper as he quickly drifted off into a troubled sleep. There were still questions to be answered, but they could wait. Bond made good progress. When Mattis came to see him 3 days later, the lower half of his body was still shrouded in the oblong tent, but he looked cheerful, and it was only occasionally that a twinge of pain narrowed his eyes. Mattis looked crestfallen. "Here's your check," he said to Bond. "I've rather enjoyed walking around with 40 million francs in my pocket. There is no sign of our friend from Smersh. Not a damn trace." "He's probably back home by now, being told off for not shooting me," said Bond. "I fancy they've got quite a file on me in view of 1 or 2 of the jobs M's given me since the war." He obviously thought he was being smart enough, cutting his initial in my hand. "What's that?" asked Mattis. "The doctor said the cuts looked like a square M with a tail to the top. He said they didn't mean anything." "Well, I only got a glimpse before I passed out. But I'm pretty certain they are the Russian letter for SH. It's rather like an inverted M with a tail. That would make sense. Smersh is short for Schmiert Spionem, death to spies, and he thinks he's labelled me as a spion. It's a nuisance because M will probably say I've got to go to hospital again when I get back to London and have new skin grafted over the whole of the back of my hand. It doesn't matter much. I've decided to resign." Mattis looked at him with his mouth open. "Resign?" he asked incredulously. "What's the hell for?" Bond looked away from Mattis. He studied his bandaged hands. "When I was being beaten up," he said, "I suddenly liked the idea of being alive." Before Le Chiffre began, he used a phrase which stuck in my mind. "Playing Red Indians." He said that's what I had been doing. Well, I suddenly thought he might be right. "You see," he said, still looking down at his bandages, "when one's young, it seems very easy to distinguish between right and wrong, and one grows up wanting to be a hero and kill the villains." He looked obstinately at Mattis. "Well, in the last few years, I've killed 2 villains. The first was in New York, a Japanese cipher expert cracking our codes. It was a pretty sound job, nice and clean, too. The next time in Stockholm wasn't so pretty. I had to kill a Norwegian who was doubling against us for the Germans. And, well, he just didn't die very quickly. For those 2 jobs, I was awarded a 00 number in the service. A 00 number in our service means you've had to kill a chap in cold blood in the course of some job. Now," he looked up again at Mattis, "that's all very fine. The hero kills 2 villains, but when the hero Le Chiffre starts to kill the villain Bond, and the villain Bond knows he isn't a villain at all, you see the other side of the medal. The villains and heroes get all mixed up. This country right or wrong business is getting a little out of date. Today we are fighting communism. If I had been alive 50 years ago, the brand of conservatism we have today would have been damn near communism, and we would have been told to go and fight that. History is moving pretty quickly, and the heroes and villains keep on changing parts." Mattis stared at him aghast. Then he tapped his head and put a calming hand on Bond's arm. "You mean to say that this precious Le Chiffre who did his best to turn you into a eunuch doesn't qualify as a villain?" he asked. "You wait till M tells you to get after another Le Chiffre. I bet you'll go after him all right. And what about Smersh? I can tell you I don't like the idea of these chaps running around France killing anyone they feel has been a traitor to their precious political system." Mattis paused at the door. "When you get back to London, you will find there are other Le Chiffres seeking to destroy you and your friends and your country. M will tell you about them. And now that you have seen a really evil man, You will know how evil they can be, and you will go after them to destroy them in order to protect yourself and the people you love. You may want to be certain that the target really is black, but there are plenty of really black targets around. And when you fall in love and have a mistress or a wife and children to look after, it will seem all the easier. Mattis opened the door and stopped on the threshold. Surround yourself with human beings, my dear James. They are easier to fight for than principles. He laughed. But don't let me down and become human yourself. We would lose such a wonderful machine. With a wave of the hand, he shut the door. "Hey!" shouted Bond. But the footsteps went quickly off down the passage. It was on the next day that Bond asked to see Vesper. He had not wanted to see her before. He was embarrassed at having to ask one or two questions about her behaviour which mystified him. The answers would almost certainly make her out to be a fool. And he had his full report to M to think about. He didn't want to have to criticise Vesper. It might easily cost her her job. But above all, he admitted to himself, he shirked the answer to a more painful question. For an hour in that room with Le Chiffre, the certainty of impotence had been beaten into him, and a scar had been left on his mind that could only be healed by experience. From that day when Bond first met Vesper in the Hermitage bar, he had found her desirable, and now he was afraid that his senses and his body would not respond to her sensual beauty. That was the real reason why he had put off their first meeting for over a week. He had expected that she would show some sign of her experiences, that she would look pale and even ill. He was not prepared for the tall, bronzed girl in a cream tussar frock who came happily through the door and stood smiling at him. "Good heavens, Vesper," he said with a wry gesture of welcome. "You look absolutely splendid. You must thrive on disaster." "I feel very guilty," she said, sitting down beside him. "But I've been bathing every day. I've found a wonderful stretch of sand down the coast, and I've managed to get over the fact that it's on the way down that road to the villa." Her voice faltered. The mention of the villa had made Bond's eyes flicker. She continued bravely, refusing to be defeated by Bond's lack of response. "I thought perhaps I could take you down to this beach later on. The doctor says that bathing will be very good for you." Bond grunted. "Oh, God knows when I'll be able to bathe, apart from anything else." He glanced pointedly down the bed. "My body's a mass of scars and bruises. Oh, but you enjoy yourself." Vesper was stung by the bitterness and injustice in his voice. "I'm sorry," she said. "I just thought—" Suddenly her eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," she said in a muffled voice. "It's all my fault." She dabbed at her eyes. "I know it's all my fault." Bond at once relented. He put out a bandaged hand and laid it on her knee. "It's all right, Vesper. I'm sorry I was so rough. It's just that I was jealous of you in the sunshine while I'm stuck here. Directly I'm well enough, you must show me your beach." Bond looked at her tenderly. Like all harsh, cold men, he was easily tipped over into sentiment. Vesper put out a hand and touched one of his. Her eyes filled with tears. "It's horrible," she said. "The things they did to you. And it was all my fault." "That's all right," said Bond comfortingly. "Now come on, let's forget about it." Vesper looked at him gratefully through her tears. "You really promise?" she asked. "I thought you would never forgive me. I'll try and make it up to you. Somehow." She was smiling at him. He smiled back. "You better look out," he said. "I may hold you to that." From that day, Bond's recovery was rapid. He sat up in bed and wrote his report to M. He made light of what he still considered amateurish behaviour on the part of Vesper. Every day Vesper came to see him, and he looked forward to these visits with excitement. He found he could speak to her easily, and he was surprised. With most women his manner was a mixture of taciturnity and passion, but in the dull room and the boredom of his treatment, her presence was each day an oasis of pleasure, something to look forward to. With enjoyable steps, Bond recovered. He was allowed up, then he was allowed to sit in the garden, then he could go for a short walk, then for a long drive. And then the afternoon came when the doctor pronounced him well again. His clothes were brought round by Vesper. Farewells were exchanged with the nurses, and a hired car drove them away. It was 3 weeks from the day when he had been on the edge of death, and now it was July, and the hot summer shimmered down the coast and out to sea. Bond clasped the moment to him. Their destination was to be a surprise for him, and Vesper insisted on being mysterious about it. Their drive was spoiled by a curious incident. While they followed the coast road in the direction of Le Chiffre's villa, Bond described her his wild chase in the Bentley, finally pointing out the curve he had taken before the crash, and the exact place where the vicious carpet of spikes had been laid. But all the time she was distrait and fidgety, and commented only in monosyllables. Once or twice he caught her glancing in the driving mirror. Finally he took her hand. "Something's on your mind, Vesper," he said. She gave him a taut, bright smile. "It's nothing. Absolutely nothing. I had a silly idea we were being followed." Under cover of a short laugh, she looked back again. "Look." There was an edge of panic in her voice. Obediently, Bond turned his head. Sure enough, a quarter of a mile away, a black saloon was coming after them at a good pace. Bond laughed. "We can't be the only people using this road," he said. "It's a middle-aged commercial traveller. He's probably thinking of his lunch and his mistress in Paris. Really, Vesper, you mustn't think evil of the innocent." "I expect you're right," she said nervously. She shook herself slightly. "Now, we'll be there in a second. I do hope you're going to like it." As they came through the dunes, they saw the sea and the modest little inn amongst the pines. "It's not very grand, I'm afraid," said Vesper, "but it's very clean, and the food's wonderful." She need not have worried. Bond loved the place at first sight. The low 2-storied house with gay brick-red awnings over the windows and the crescent-shaped bay of blue water and golden sands. They drew up in the courtyard behind the house, and the proprietor and his wife came out to greet them. Monsieur Versoix showed them to their rooms. When the proprietor left them, Bond pushed her inside and closed the door. Then he put his hands on her shoulders and kissed her on both cheeks. "This is heaven," he said. And he saw that her eyes were shining. Her hands came up and rested on his forearms. He stepped right up against her, and her head went back, and her mouth opened beneath his. "My darling," he said. He slipped his hands down to her swelling buttocks and gripped them fiercely, pressing the centres of their bodies together. Panting, she slipped her mouth away from his, and they clung together while he rubbed his cheek against hers and felt her hard breasts pressing into him. She pushed him away and sank back, exhausted, onto the bed. For a moment they looked at each other hungrily. "I'm sorry, Vesper," he said. "I didn't mean to, then." She shook her head, dumb with the storm which had passed through her. Bond put his arm round her, but she got up and walked over to the window. She stood there with her back to him. "It's going to take some time to get ready for dinner," said Vesper, still not looking at him. "Why don't you go and bathe? I'll unpack for you." Bond walked over to the door and looked back. She had not moved. For some reason he thought she was crying. He took a step towards her, and then realized that there was nothing to say between them then. Bond walked along to his room and sat down on the bed. He felt weak from the passion which had swept through his body. He longed to be cooled and revived by the sea. He went over to his suitcase and took out white linen bathing trunks and a dark blue pyjama coat. As he went downstairs and passed across the front of the house, he thought of Vesper, but refrained from looking up to see if she was still standing at the window. When he was out of sight of the inn, he threw off his pyjama coat and took a short run and a quick flat dive into the small waves. The beach shelved quickly, and he kept under water as long as he could, feeling the soft coolness all over him. Then he surfaced and brushed the hair out of his eyes. It was nearly 7, and the sun had lost much of its heat. When he came ashore, nearly a mile down the bay, he knew he had time to lie on the hard sand and dry before the tide of dusk reached him. He gazed up at the empty blue sky and thought of Vesper. His feelings for her were confused, and he was impatient with the confusion. They had been so simple. He had intended to sleep with her as soon as he could, because he desired her and also because he wanted coldly to put the repairs to his body to the final test. But somehow she had crept under his skin, and over the last 2 weeks his feelings had gradually changed. There was something enigmatic about her, which was a constant stimulus. Naked, Bond lay and tried to push away the conclusions he read in the sky. He turned his head and looked down the beach and saw that the shadows of the headland were almost reaching for him. He stood up and walked back along the beach. He slipped on the light coat and walked on to the hotel. At that moment, his mind was made up. Bond dressed in a white shirt and dark blue slacks. He was pleased when Vesper appeared in the doorway, wearing a blue linen shirt which had faded to the colour of her eyes. "I couldn't wait. I was famished. My room's over the kitchen, and I've been tortured by the wonderful smells." She took his hand, and together they went downstairs and out onto the terrace. Champagne stood on a plated wine cooler beside their table, and Bond poured out 2 full glasses. They looked at each other and drank deeply, and Bond filled their glasses again to the rim. All through the meal they left unspoken their feelings for each other, but in Vesper's eyes as much as in Bond's, there was excited anticipation of the night. When the lobster had come and gone and the second bottle of champagne was half empty, Vesper gave a deep sigh of contentment. "I've never been so spoiled before." She gazed across the terrace at the moonlit bay. "I wish I deserved it." Her voice had a wry undertone. "What do you mean?" asked Bond, surprised. "Oh, I don't know. I suppose people get what they deserve, so perhaps I do deserve it." Suddenly she gave a happy laugh. "Don't look so worried." She took a sip of champagne. The small shadow had passed. It quickly dissolved as warmth and intimacy enclosed them again. When they had had their coffee, Vesper came and stood behind him. "I'm tired," she said. She bent down and lightly brushed his hair with her lips. Then she was gone, and a few seconds later the light came on in her room. Bond smoked and waited until it had gone out. Then he followed her, pausing only to say good night to the proprietor and his wife and thank them for the dinner. It was only 9:30 when he stepped into her room from the bathroom and closed the door behind him. The moonlight shone through the half-closed shutters and lapped at the secret shadows in the snow of her body on the broad bed. Bond awoke in his own room at dawn. He got quietly out of bed and crept past Vesper's door and out of the house to the beach. For a time he swam and drifted, and then when the sun seemed hot enough, he came into the beach and lay on his back and revelled in the body which the night had given back to him. As on the evening before, he stared up into the empty sky and saw the same answer there. That day he would ask Vesper to marry him. As he walked quietly from the terrace into the half-darkness of the still-shuttered dining room, he was surprised to see Vesper emerge from the glass-fronted telephone booth near the front door and softly turn up the stairs towards their rooms. "Vesper," he called, thinking she must have had some urgent message which might concern them both. She turned quickly, a hand up to her mouth. For a moment longer than necessary, she stared at him, her eyes wide. "Oh," she said breathlessly, "you made me jump. It was only, I was just telephoning to Mattis. To Mattis," she repeated. "I wondered if you could get me another frock, you know, from that girlfriend I told you about, the vendeuse. You see," she talked quickly, her words coming out in a persuasive jumble, "I've really got nothing to wear. Oh, is the water nice? Have you bathed? You ought to have waited for me." "It's wonderful," said Bond, deciding to relieve her mind, though irritated with her obvious guilt over this childish mystery. "You must go in, and we'll have breakfast on the terrace. I'm ravenous. I'm sorry I made you jump." He put his arm round her, but she disengaged herself and moved quickly on up the stairs. That was the end of the integrity of their love. It seemed fantastic to Bond that human relationships could collapse into dust overnight, and he searched his mind again and again for a reason. He felt that Vesper was just as horrified as he was. At luncheon that day, things got worse. Directly they sat down, he apologized gaily for having startled her at the telephone booth, but Vesper avoided Bond's eyes. All of a sudden her fork fell with a clatter onto the edge of her plate. She had gone as white as a sheet, and she was looking over his shoulder with terror in her face. Bond turned and saw that a man had just taken his place at a table on the opposite side of the terrace, well away from them. He seemed ordinary enough, perhaps rather somberly dressed. "It's the man in the car," she said in a stifled voice. "The man who was following us. I know it is." Bond looked again over his shoulder. The man seemed to realize that he was being watched. Bond noticed that he had a black patch over one eye. He turned back to Vesper. "Really, darling, he looks very innocent." He tried to reason with her, but she paid no attention. After glancing once or twice over his shoulder with eyes that held a curious submissiveness, she said that she would spend the afternoon in her room. She walked indoors without a backward glance. A few minutes later, the man asked for the bill and left. When the patron came back, Bond casually asked about the other customer. The patron answered that the man was Swiss, a traveller in watches. He had said that he would be passing that way again in a day or two and would take another meal at the auberge. It was shocking to have only one eye. "It is indeed very sad," said Bond. Then he rose. "By the way," he said, "Madame had an early telephone call, which I must remember to pay for. Paris, an Elysit number, I think," he added, remembering that that was Mattis's exchange. "Oh, thank you, monsieur. The exchange mentioned a call to Paris. But let me see. It was an Invalide number the exchange referred to." On Sunday, the man with the black patch was back again. Bond knew it directly he looked up from his lunch and saw Vesper's face. She left her lunch in the middle and went straight to her room. He made up his mind. When he had finished, he followed her. Both her doors were locked, and when he made her let him in, he saw that she'd been sitting in the shadows by the window, watching, he presumed. "Vesper," he said, holding her cold hands in his, "we can't go on like this. Either you must tell me what all this is about, or we must leave. At once." She said nothing, and her hands were lifeless in his. "My darling," he said, "won't you tell me? Do you know, that first morning, I was coming back to ask you to marry me. Can't we go back to the beginning again?" At first she said nothing. Then a tear rolled slowly down her cheek. "You mean you would have married me?" Bond nodded. "Oh, my God," she said. "My God." She turned and clutched him, pressing her face against his chest. He held her closely to him. Her sobs became quieter. "Leave me a little," she said, and a new note had come into her voice, a note of resignation. "I must have time to think." That evening, most of the gayness and intimacy of their first night came back. Some of her laughter sounded brittle, but Bond was determined to fall in with her new mood. "Give me some more champagne," she said. She gave a queer little laugh. "I want a lot more." They sat and drank together until the bottle was finished. Then she got to her feet. She knocked against her chair and giggled. "Come up quickly," she said. "I want you badly tonight." She blew a kiss at him and was gone. For 2 hours they made slow, sweet love in a mood of happy passion, which the day before Bond would never have thought they could regain. When he finally rose and bent to kiss her eyes and her mouth good night, she reached out and turned on the light. "Look at me," she said, "and let me look at you." He knelt beside her. Her deep blue eyes were swimming with tears as she drew his head slowly towards her and kissed him gently on the lips. "Good night, my dearest love," she said. Bond walked to his room with a full heart. The patron burst into Bond's room holding an envelope in front of him, as if it was on fire. "There has been a terrible accident. Madame—" Bond hurled himself out of bed. Vesper's door was open. The sunlight through the shutters lit up the room. Only her black hair showed above the sheet, and her body under the bedclothes was straight and moulded like a stone effigy on a tomb. Bond fell on his knees beside her and drew back the sheet. She was asleep, she must be. Her eyes were closed. And yet she was so still. No movement, no pulse, no breath. That was it. There was no breath. Later, the patron came and touched him on the shoulder. He pointed at the empty glass beside her, and on the floor an empty bottle of sleeping pills. Bond rose to his feet and shook himself. The patron was holding out the letter towards him. He took it and walked blindly away. He sat on the edge of his bed and gazed out of the window at the peaceful sea. Then he turned the envelope over and opened it. After the first few words, he read quickly, the breath coming harshly through his nostrils. Then he threw the letter down on the bed, as if it had been a scorpion. "My darling James, I love you with all my heart, and I hope you still love me, because now, with these words, this is the last moment that your love will last. I am a double agent for the Russians. I was taken on a year after the war, and I have worked for them ever since. I was in love with a Pole in the RAF. Until you, I still was. After the war he was trained by M and dropped back into Poland. They caught him, and by torturing him they found out a lot and also about me. They came after me and told me he could live if I would work for them. He knew nothing of this, but he was allowed to write to me. The letter arrived on the 15th of each month. I couldn't bear the idea of a 15th coming round without his letter. I tried to give them as little as possible. You must believe me about this. Then it came to you. I told them you had been given this job at Royale, what your cover was, and so on. That was why they knew about you before you arrived and why they had time to put the microphones in. They suspected Le Chiffre, but they didn't know what your assignment was except that it was something to do with him. That was all I told them. Then I had to stage that kidnapping. But when I found out what had been done to you, I decided I couldn't go on. By that time, I had begun to fall in love with you. They wanted me to find out things from you while you were recovering, but I refused. I was controlled from Paris. I had to ring up an Invalide number twice a day. They threatened me, and finally they withdrew my control, and I knew my lover in Poland would have to die. But they were afraid I would talk, I suppose, and I got a final warning that Smersh would come for me if I didn't obey them. Then I saw the man with the black patch. I knew it would be the end of our love if I told you. I realized that I could either wait to be killed by Smersh, or I could kill myself. There it is, my darling love. It's late now, and I'm tired, and you're just through 2 doors. But I've got to be brave. You might save my life, but I couldn't bear the look in your dear eyes. Bond threw the letter down. Mechanically, he brushed his fingers together. Suddenly he banged his temples with his fists and stood up. Then he cursed aloud, one harsh obscenity. His eyes were wet, and he dried them. With a set, cold face, he walked down and shut himself in the telephone booth. While he was getting through to London, he calmly reviewed the facts of Vesper's letter. They all fitted. The little shadows and question marks which his instinct had noticed but his mind rejected all stood out now like signposts. He saw her now only as a spy. Their love and his grief were relegated to the box-room of his mind. Now he could only think of her treachery to the service. His professional mind was completely absorbed with the consequences, the covers which must have been blown over the years, the secrets which must have leaked from the centre of the very section devoted to penetrating the Soviet Union. Suddenly, Matisse's words came back to him. There are plenty of real villains. What about Smersh? How soon Matisse had been proved right. While he, Bond, had been playing Red Indians, the real enemy had been working quietly, coldly, right there at his elbow. Well, it was not too late. Here was a target for him. He would take on Smersh and hunt it down, go after the threat behind the spies, the threat that made them spy. The telephone rang and Bond snatched up the receiver. He was on to the Link, the only man in London he might telephone from abroad, then only in dire necessity. This is 007 speaking. This is an open line. It's an emergency. Can you hear me? Pass this on at once. 3030 was a double. Working for Redland. Yes, damn it, I said was. The bitch is dead now.
Casino Royale was read by Alex Jennings, abridged by Sally Marmion and produced by Di Spears. In September 1988, 11-year-old Tom Gregory became the youngest person ever to swim the English Channel, trained by an extraordinary coach at his local swimming baths in Eltham, south-east London, which